What is going on, guys? Agus here with another Cinema 4D tutorial, and it feels an absolute age since I last did a Cinema 4D tutorial, but we're back with a fun tutorial. So let's take a look at what we're going to be creating today. So here in the preview we've got this bouncing text coming in, as well as the camera spinning round. So this is a really cool tutorial today because we're going to be creating the text and then using effectors, and then also we're going to be building the scene with lights. So this is all done from scratch, and we're going to make a little mini camera rig with some espresso on. So it's all fun today, so let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to open up a new scene, and the first thing that I'm going to do is come to my render settings and change the output to 720p at 30 frames per second. So the first place that we're going to start is the text. So we're going to come up to the MoGraph text and add a Mo text, and we're going to call this Cinema 4D. And the font that I used in the example was Lot. It's a free font, so you just Google it and download it if you want, or you can use a font of your choice. And I'm just going to change the perspective to the front perspective here, and I'm going to increase the horizontal spacing a little bit, and I'm going to decrease the vertical spacing like so, and then I'm going to change the align from left to middle, and then I'm just going to move it up like so. I'm going to rename this Mo text to C4D underscore Mo text, and then we're going to change the depth from 20 to 100, and now we can switch back to our 3D perspective view. And then we're going to come over to the caps and change to fillet cap on both of them, and the steps are going to be 4 and the radius is going to be 4 centimeters. Same again, steps 4, radius 4. And then we're going to come up to this tab here and add a connect object. And we're going to drop our Mo text into the connect object like so. And then what we're going to do, we're going to copy and paste that connect object, and we're going to come into the Mo text, and we're going to reduce the depth to 75 like so. And on our original Mo text, you want to come to the caps and then select constrain, and then go back to our duplicated text, and we're just going to move this into the middle. So this is going to give us a nice beveled text edge effect. And once we have this done, we're going to select it all and come up to the MoGraph tab and select fracture object, and then we're going to drop both of these connect objects into the fracture object, and then select the fracture and change the mode from straight to explode segments. Cool, so now we have our text. The next thing to do is set up the lighting. So I'm going to come up to the light tab and select target light, and then I'm going to select the light and then come over to general, and we're going to change the type to area, and then we're going to come over to the details tab, and we're going to change the X and Y size to 2500. So this is going to give us a really big light, and we can move it back and round just a little bit. We're going to call this light the key light. And if we go on to the general, we're going to change the colour of this light to a nice light blue, and we're going to set the shadow to soft maps, and then we want to come into the details tab and make sure that show in reflection is checked. And once we've done that, we're going to copy and paste the light, and we're going to rename this light fill, and then we're just going to move the fill light around and position it somewhere like so. Maybe move it back a little bit. And I'm going to change the colour of this light to quite an intense pink colour. And we're going to add one more light, so we're going to copy and paste, and we're going to call this the backlight. And then we want to change the colour of this to a nice light yellowy orange colour. And then we're going to swing round and reposition the backlight on the back of the text at the top. So you should have a lighting setup that looks something like this. Feel free to play around with the different colours of the lights if you want to get a different effect on your text. And we're going to select all of these three lights and also the light target, and we're going to come up to create object null, and we're going to place these into the null object, and we're going to call this lighting. And I'm going to come over to the layers tab. I've already got it selected here, but if you haven't, you can come up to window and to the lighting layer. And what this allows us to do is we can solo the lights, or we can do it with the text as well. So we're going to add another one, add a new layer. I'm going to call this MoText, and I'm going to select all the MoText, including the fracture objects, and we're going to drop that onto the MoText layer. So you can see now that we can solo the MoText if we just want to work on the text, or if we want to work on the lights, we can solo the lights as well. So the next step is to add some of the effectors to start getting this bouncing effect. And what we're going to do is select, with the fracture object selected, you want to come up to the MoGraph tab and then select effectors, and we're going to be using the shader effector. And with the shader selector, you want to come over to the parameter and uncheck scale and check position. You want to come over to the fall off tab on the shader and change the shape from infinite to box, and we want to scale this box up all the way to encompass the text. So now we have the shader effector, and if we move the shader effector, you can see we're already getting that kind of effect. So now let's add some keyframes to this. So I'm going to come up to the front perspective, and I'm using the timeline down here as well, and if you haven't got the timeline, you can come up to window and select timeline there, and that will pop up the timeline. And what we want to do, instead of using the normal keyframe button, we're going to use the auto keyframe button. So with that selected, we're going to move to if we just change our frames from 90 to maybe 400, or maybe that's a bit too much, 300, and just increase our timeline a little bit. So we're going to move to maybe like 60 frames on the timeline, and with the auto keyframe button selected, we're just going to move the shader effect to left to around there, and that's going to automatically add a keyframe because we have the auto keyframe button selected. So just uncheck the auto keyframe button, and if we play now, you can see we have the effect of the text dropping in. And now what we want to do is move to maybe 100 frames, and then we're just going to set a keyframe there. So what's happening is the text is going to drop in. It's going to stay there until 100 frames to give the viewer time to read the text, and then maybe 130 frames we're going to move the shader back across and set a keyframe there. So if we play now, we have this animation of the text dropping down and then also flying back up. But I don't want the text to fly back up, I actually want it to go down after. So instead of, if we move to 100 frames and then select our shader, and we come over to the parameter, and if we hold down Command or Control if you're on a Windows and select the Y position, and then we're going to move forward just a single frame to 101, and then we're going to set this to -1000 and then hold down Command or Control and add another keyframe. What's going to happen is instead of the text flying up, it's going to fly down like so. And we could do with making this just a little bit longer. It's going down just a bit too fast at the moment. Maybe just make it a little bit longer. Maybe to 150 frames. There we go, that's looking nice. Now the next one is to add the bouncing effect, and the bouncing effect was done with a delay shader. So you want to make sure that the fracture object is selected, and then come up to MoGraph effectors, and we want a delay effector, and going to come up to the effector tab and change the strength from 50 to 75 and the mode from blend to spring. And if we play now, we have a really nice bouncing effect. So the next step is to create the After Effects text. So if we just quickly have a look at the example, you can see that the Cinema 4D text drops in, and then the camera spins around, and then the After Effects text drops into. So to create that, it's really easy. All you have to do is, I'm going to create another group for these shaders. So create a new null object, and then we're going to drop these shaders into the null object and call this null object effectors. And we can also come to our layer tab, and we're going to select a new layer, and we're going to make this one maybe an orange. I'm going to select both of the effectors as well as the null. I'm going to drag that onto the orange layer. I'm going to rename the orange layer effectors. And I'm just going to once again create another null object. I'm going to rename this to text rig, and I'm going to drop the effectors null and the fracture null into the text rig. And what we can do now is if we select the text rig and copy and paste it, and if we just drop down the effectors, and we're going to change the shader to shader.to, so we know the difference between the different text rig. I'm going to rename this text rig.to. So now instead of rebuilding that whole text again, we can just come into the text objects of the second rig and we just rename them to After Effects. And make sure to do it on the other text as well. So now what we have is two different text rigs, but you can see that they're playing at the same time, and that's not what we want. So if we come down to the timeline here and select the shader 2 and we move the keyframes up to around here. Now this is the advantage of using the timeline over just the normal timeline here. So you can see you have a lot more controls over the keyframes when using the timeline. And what we want to do, we want to get it so that as the cinema text drops away, the After Effects text just starts to come in at the same time. So around that. Now there's a small problem. It's not really a problem, but you can see that as we're scrubbing through the timeline, what the delay effector is doing is it's making it bounce too much, and that's only when we're scrubbing through the timeline. If we play, you can see that it's normal, but when we're scrubbing through the timeline it goes a little bit crazy. So a way to resolve that issue is if we select our fracture object on our text rig 1 and we right click Cinema 4D tags, and we want not Cinema 4D tags, we want MoGraph tags, and then MoGraph chase. And what we're going to do is select bake, and we're going to do it again on the fracture object of the second text rig. So that's MoGraph tags, MoGraph chase, and then we're going to hit bake again. And what that's going to do, that's going to bake the animation, so you can see as we scrub through it now, it's actually, the animation is actually baked. So what we're seeing when we scrub through the timeline is the same as if we play. So what we're going to do next is create the camera rig. So first off, I'm going to create a target camera, but I'm going to delete the camera target null. And what we want is if we select the camera and then the camera target tag, come over to our attributes, and we want the target object to be the light target. And we're just going to move the light target just in the middle of the text. And also I'm going to come over to our splines tab and we're going to add a helix, and we're going to come over to our layers tab and we're going to make a new layer, and we're going to call this camera rig, and then we're going to drop the camera and the helix spline onto the camera rig layer, and then we're going to solo the camera rig layer. So all that we have in our scene is the helix spline and the camera. So if we come over to the attributes of the helix and we change the plane from XY to XZ, and then we're going to change the start and end radius to 2500, and we're also going to increase the height to 1000. Going to change the end angle to 1000, and we're just going to increase the height just so we have some space in between. And now what we're going to do is align the camera to the spline. So to do that, all we have to do is right click on the camera, Cinema 4D tags align to spline, and then we're going to drag the helix into the spline path. And you can see if we change the position on the align to spline tag, you can see we now have a camera that rotates along that helix. And I'm just going to want to come into the front perspective, and I'm going to rotate the helix on a 45-degree angle. Maybe a 20-degree angle like so. And now if we come back to our layers tab and unsolo this, and we view through our camera and then select the align to spline tag, you can see we now have, by moving the position, we have a really nice camera animation like so. But we're just going to add a little bit of expressor to this camera rig just to make it a little bit easier for controlling the position and rotation of the camera along the spline. So what we're going to do is highlight the camera and the spline, and we're going to create a new null object. I'm going to call this camera rig, and we're also going to want to drop that onto our camera rig layers as well. And we want to drop the camera and helix into the camera rig null. And then with the camera rig null selected, we want to right click Cinema 4D tags expressor, and then we're going to drag the camera rig null into the expressor editor. And we're also going to drag the align to spline tag in there as well. And if we select the camera rig and come up to user data, manage user data, add new group, and we're going to drag it out of the user data group, and we're going to rename this new group camera rig, and then select OK. And then we want to come over to our align to spline tag, and if we right click on the position, you're going to see copy user data interface. And then if we come back to our camera rig and then select user data, manage user data, and select the camera rig and then paste the user data, you can see that we have the position. And instead of float on the interface, we want it to be a float slider, and then just hit OK. And then in the Espresso window, we want to come up to the camera rig and select the output, the red output, and then camera rig position. And then we're going to select the blue input on the spline node and select tag properties and then position. And then we're just going to link those up. And what we can do now is actually close the camera rig null, and we can actually control the camera position without actually going into the null, without having to open it up and then select the align to spline tag. We can do it just by selecting the camera rig. So now what we're going to do is create the camera animation. So if we head to 0 on the timeline and we set the position to 0, just one thing before we start adding any keyframes or anything, I just want to change the perspective of the camera. So if we come up to the object and we want to change the focal length to 50mm, and also we want to change to 35mm movie instead of 35mm photo. and what we can do now is move to 0 on the timeline and also 0 on the position, and we're going to hold down Command and add a keyframe for the position, and then we're going to move to maybe 50 or 60 frames on the timeline, and then we're going to spin all the way around to around here and add a keyframe, and then we're going to move to just before the text moves off. We're going to increase the position just a little bit and then add another keyframe. So if we play now, you can see we have the animation of the camera spinning round, and then it's slowly panning across to read the text. So I'm just going to move the middle keyframe. I'm going to move it up a little bit, just so it spins around faster at the start. To around here and set a keyframe, and we're going to move forward just before the text starts to drop away, and then we're going to increase the position just a little bit and add another keyframe. So what's happening is when the camera is round the back of the text, it's spinning round really fast, and then as it comes to the front, it slowly pans across to allow the user to read the text, and then it spins round fast and then allows the user to read the text again. And we could also, after the text has dropped away, we could move forward a little bit just to add a little bit more motion. So this is endless. We're using 2 rigs at the moment, so we have 2 different text, but you could have unlimited amount of text and spin round loads of times. So if you wanted maybe 4 text objects, you could do that as well. So it's pretty limitless the amount that you could do with this. So if we play, we have the nice spinning round and then panning. So this is all good at the moment. One of the last steps to do is just add a few textures, and then I think we're pretty much done, and I'm just going to show you how to quickly render it and then maybe bring it into After Effects and do a bit of really basic colour correction, and then maybe add a couple of optical flares just for the fun of it. So to create the textures, I'm going to come up to Create, New Material, and this one's going to be a nice white, glossy white. So I'm going to make this a nice white colour, and reflection for now, and we're going to drop the brightness and mix strength down. And what we're going to do, we're going to need to drop down our text rig 1, and I'm going to pop the texture onto the first connect object. So that's going to texture the inside of the text, and then we're going to come up to Create New Material, and we're going to come up to Color, Gradient, and And there's one more thing. If we come up to the environments tab, we're going to add a background, and we're going to create a new material again, and we're going to select color, uncheck specular, select color, gradient, and we're going to change it to 2D circular. And if we come into the gradient, we're going to change the black to a sort of darky grey pink colour. I'm going to change the white to a darky pinky sort of colour, like that. And then all we have to do is drop that material onto the background, and we just do a quick render test. It's looking good. So as you can see, we have everything all done. There's just one thing that we need to do is come over to our render settings and the anti-aliasing, and we want to change it to best and change the filter from cubic to Mitchell. And if we render again, you can see we have these nice reflections now, and all that's left to do is render. So what we can do is come to our render settings, and we're going to select the output 720p. You can do you can do 1080p if you want, 30 frames per second, and we want to change the frame range to all frames. And then we want to come up to save, and then you want to navigate to your folder. I'm going to create a new folder and call this render sequence version 2. And I'm going to call this motext underscore render underscore 001, and then hit save. So now we've chosen the destination in which to render to, and we're going to change the format from TIFF to portable network graphic, and then we're gonna, I think that's pretty much it. Make sure that the anti-aliasing is at best. We don't need any ambient occlusion or any global illumination. So I think that text is a really well lit and textured text for no global illumination or any ambient occlusion. So that's going to really speed up your render time. You can see that that frame took 2 seconds to render, so it's going to be really quick. You can add ambient occlusion if you wish, but to be honest, I don't really think it needs it. It's only going to increase the render times. So you want to check that all the outputs are in the right place, and then we're going to double check that the destination is right and the format is right. We're going to double check the anti-aliasing, and we look to ready to go for our render. So all we have to do is render to the picture viewer. And you can see it's going to start to render. And I'm just going to pause it here, and then we'll come back when the rendering's done, and then we'll head on into After Effects and do just a really basic quick color correction. Okay, and we're back and the render is finished. It's looking good, but there was one thing that I forgot to do, which was, if we look at the Cinema 4D text here, it's looking good, but then the After Effects drops in with no textures. So before you render, you want to make sure that you apply the textures to the text rig 2 as well. So all you have to do is, like we did on the original text, drop the pink onto the second connector, and then drop the white onto the first connector, and if we scrub through, then the After Effects will be textured as well. So that was my fault, I forgot to add the textures on the After Effects. Okay, but we're rendered now, and if we open up After Effects, come up to File, Import, File, and then what I'm going to do, we're going to navigate to our tutorial folder or wherever you saved your render sequence, and I'm going to use the example render sequence only because I forgot to add the textures on the second render, so we're just going to use this one for now, and we're going to import that, and then we're going to drag the image sequence down into the create new composition. And what that's going to do, that's going to create a brand new composition, the exact length and with the exact frame rate of our image sequence. So now you can see we have our image sequence in After Effects like so. And the first thing that I'm going to do is add a curves adjustment. So come up to your effects and presets and then type in curves, and we're just going to drag the curves on, and we're just going to bring the dark down, and then we're just going to bring the light up just to give it a little bit more pop. And then we're going to come up to layer, new adjustment layer, and then we're going to come up to effect, video copilot, optical flares, and we're going to change the options. And if we come up to the presets browser and come into motion graphics, the one that I used on the example was Golden Sun, which is this one here. And if we just select OK, and we're going to change the render mode to over transparent, and then we're going to change the brightness to 500, and we're going to move the position just to the top left hand corner. Like so, and that's going to give us that really nice flaring effect. And we could also just come in and adjust the curves a little bit more. And there we go, and we could also add some motion blur. So if you select this button right here, which is enable motion blur for all layers with the motion blur switch selected, so you want to select that, and then come over to your image sequence and then select the motion blur tab, which is this one right here, and that's going to give us some really nice motion blur when the text drops in. So all that's left to do now is render. So you want to come up to composition, add to render queue, and then you want to save the output to. I'm just going to choose the tutorial folder, and then select the output module and choose your format. I tend to go with Apple ProRes or H.264, but that's just my personal preference. You can choose whichever format works best for you. And then audio, if you're using audio, double check that the audio option is selected and then hit OK. And then all that's left to do is hit render and you are done. So that pretty much wraps it up for today's tutorial. I really hope you enjoyed it and you learned some cool new stuff. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on any brand new videos, and I will see you again very soon in another video tutorial.